Today, it's our delight to be speaking with Dr. Jacob Shatzer. Dr. Shatzer is Associate Professor and Associate Dean in the School of Theology and Missions at University and author of the intriguing text that we'll be discussing today, Transhumanism in the Image of God, Today's Technology and the Future of Christian Discipleship. Dr. Shatzer, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Dr. Shatzer, this is the first book that we've reviewed on transhumanism. So would you be willing to just tell us quickly about your journey to this extremely interesting topic?
Yeah. So this topic in particular came out of just some different, I guess, questions that I had as I thought about theology and ethics, tracing as far back as right around the end of my undergraduate years. I remember sitting at a park, actually not far from where I am right now. There's a park called Liberty Park that's about a half a mile from Union University. And I remember sitting there with a friend, and we were just kind of talking about theology, that kind of thing that you do when you're a just graduated senior. And we were talking about, ethics, good and bad. And we were talking about virtual reality. And we were wondering, what is it a sin to kill someone in virtual reality? Right? Those kind of what we thought were interesting questions at that time. And that kind of, I guess, led to a developing interest for me in considering issues of moral formation and ethics from a theological perspective, but in particular looking at technology, just because I think technology obviously poses unique challenges today, but also helps us ask questions in new ways that can kind of help us think about some of the things that we hold close to our hearts.
Do you and Jason Thacker talk on these topics? It seems like the Southern Baptist world is producing young thinkers who are thinking about the interface of technology and faith issues, and I'm wondering where that's coming from.
I have interacted a little bit with Jason at the ERLC. So I'm a research fellow with the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. And so we've interacted at some different things. We worked together on the statement on artificial intelligence that the ERLC did last year. So we've had a few conversations here and there, but he and I have never overlapped institutionally or anything, or had real developed conversation, just more kind of separate interests along the same way.
Super. Dr. Shatzer, how do you define transhumanism?
So transhumanism, first of all, is difficult to define because it refers to such a large and just a big variety of different types of thinking, but we have to kind of narrow it a bit to give a definition, and maybe we can think of it as like a center of gravity that these different views rotate around. And so transhumanism is basically focused on the idea that we can and should move beyond what we currently think it means to be human. So you may have also heard the term posthumanism. These terms are related, and they kind of come from different areas, but really the way I try to highlight it in the book and explain to people at the start is just posthumanism is this idea of moving beyond the human, what's going to be next in this the series of evolution. It comes from an evolutionary perspective. So posthumanism is whatever is next. Transhumanism is more focused on what are the things that we can do, the processes that we can employ, the ways that we can work on the way there. So the transhumanism is a little more focused on the process. Posthumanism a little more focused on whatever that goal or next thing might be, but they're obviously related.
So transhumanism is this view that humanity can become something beyond our current conceptions of what it means to be human. From such a broad view, seems like that could be harmonized with Christian worldview. What's your view?
Yeah, so absolutely, and this is one of the things that's interesting, even with how books are developed. So this book, as I said, I was beginning to think about these questions over a decade ago. I did some doctoral work in technology, ethics, and things like that at Marquette University almost 10 years ago now. And then I wrote this book primarily in over a period of 2 or 3 years, from probably 2016 to 2018, and then it came out in 2019. So at the time of my writing of the book, what I really wanted to focus on was the way that Christians are subtly drawn into some transhumanist ideas, but they wouldn't think that they would be transhumanists. Because at the time there really weren't a lot of Christians that were adopting a transhumanist perspective. Now, of course, after the book is out, there is a growing Christian Transhumanist Association. And so there are Christian believers who do think that there are elements about transhumanism that Christians can embrace. So it's a bit of a long answer, I suppose. And you asked about my thinking on it, and I think it depends. So transhumanism and posthumanism are both built on an evolutionary worldview, and they both reject essentialism. In other words, they reject that there's really anything that stays the same that we can point at and say that is human, right? They're both built on the assumptions that human is essentially socially constructed or socially defined, and we can continually change that definition and that idea. And so that's the basic assumption of most transhumanists and posthumanists. For Christians, because Christians are taught that we are created in the image of God, and there's something to that we are given, that we receive, and that we can't just change. And so personally, I don't embrace the terminology of transhumanism because I think it brings too much baggage with it. But there certainly are Christians who do, and who would want to say, yeah, but we don't have to completely embrace all those other things. And they're right. It just comes down to the wisdom of accepting the term or not, I think.
Getting the definitions right is going to be a big part of the game of analyzing from a Christian perspective the transhumanist movement. My first introduction to transhumanism was when I read the 2005 book by Ray Kurzweil, The Singularity is Near. And that book is very clearly not a Christian view. I'm not excluding Ray Kurzweil. He himself postures himself very antithetically towards Christianity. And it seemed to me that the core of transhumanism, at least as exposited by Kurzweil, was the idea that all of human experience, all human mental processes can be pulled down or can be formulated in a series of digital information, that the human consciousness can be digitized. Is that correct? Is that at the core of transhumanism more broadly, or is that only a wing of a larger movement?
So I think that, I don't know that I would say it's definitely at the core, especially when you think of the way transhumanism is seen in popular culture most recently. But what I try to do in the book, and the way that I encourage people to think about transhumanism, is to think of it in stages, kind of moving from the biological to the digital. And so in the book, I deal with different steps along the way there. You have ways that we can incorporate technology, but basically remain human bodies by and large. But then you also have kind of a middle ground where there is hybrids created, whether that's a cyborg type creature or something like that, where there's a more even distribution between the biological and the digital. And then you do have on the extreme end then the perspective that you mentioned, which is the goal is to get away from the biological altogether. Some of these transhumanists will refer to the body as a meat suit. We've got to get rid of the meat suit. All of human problems are related to being in a meat suit. It wears out, it breaks down. We just need to get into a computer, a digital substrate, and then we'll be able to live forever and we won't have the problems that we have. So there are, I think it's best to think of it along a spectrum, because especially because as Christians, I think many people would still think, oh wait, no, that's not good. I know enough about Christianity to know that there's something about a resurrection and an eternal embodied state and things like that. So I know that I shouldn't want to become a computer. And so we think, oh, I'm not a transhumanist because I don't want to upload my mind into a computer. But really, transhumanism is broader than that and includes some less extreme examples as well that I think that we may be drawn to in different ways.
There's a lot of tech talk in our environment today. A lot of people talking, for example, about artificial intelligence. And it sounds like a really pie in the sky theory until we remember that Alexa or Siri are driven by AI algorithms. How do we encounter post-humanism today? Is it still in a sort of philosophical stage, or do we encounter it in our culture currently?
So I think that some of the values that transhumanists and posthumanists hold are things that we do very much encounter in our culture today. And so there's a strong belief in kind of a libertarian freedom towards technological development, which is built on this this optimism that all we need is more technological solutions. And even if a new problem comes up, we'll come up with a technological solution to that. I mean, we're in the midst of that right now with this pandemic, right? And I'm not saying that this is wrong. This highlights something. We have a strong faith in science. We're all waiting for that vaccine, and we're getting excited when we see the headlines about things moving from phase 1 trials to phase 2 trials and things like that. I think that that's a good thing, and we could talk about bioethics separately and the importance of medicine, and Christians have always been at the forefront of the development of medicine and things like that. But all of that beside, it still illustrates this idea that all we really need and all we really want is a technological solution. And we might not think that we're transhumanists or posthumanists, but that's actually a really big step. Once you start to make that step, whether you acknowledge it or not, that you're, I guess if we use some biblical language, where does my hope come from? My hope comes from Silicon Valley, maker of everything technological. And we begin to see there some of the ways that we are confronting that in our day-to-day lives, even if we're not making plans to upload our brain into a computer.
Let's talk right about that. Uploading our minds. It's a concept that floats around a little bit in our popular culture. Do you think it'll ever be possible?
Yeah, so this is a controversial topic, even among post-humanists and transhumanists. So it assumes you have to take a couple steps, and there are disagreement at each of these steps. One of the steps is that everything about what it means to be human can be reduced to zeros and ones, can be reduced to computer code. Not everyone would agree with that. So I think there are probably some Christian reasons to not agree with that. But that's the first step. And so for those who say, no, you can't do that, well, then automatically mind uploading and that is not possible. The second step, if you say, okay, yeah, that's possible, well, then you have the question of, well, how do you do that? And there are different scenarios with this about, scanning brains and things like that. And some people think that the technology will get there, that we can do that, and some people don't. So if you don't think the technology is going to be able to do that, even if you think we could reduce humanity to zeros and ones, well, then the answer is no. But if you think that we could also do that, well, then you have another question, which becomes, what exactly do you have once you do that? So let's assume we have you, Dr. Armstrong, and we scan your brain. We have everything about you now on a hard drive. Well, what do we actually have now? We just have a clone of you because you're still existing, which creates two problems. First, the fact that now there are two, but also as soon as you look at that hard drive and you realize, that hard drive has me in it, well, you've just had a new thought that you've had after that upload happened. And so now you're different. So there's not even two identical ones anymore. And so then there's that problem, the problem of identity between the human and the data. And that's a problem, whether it's creating a copy of a living brain, or as people who have had their heads cryogenically frozen are hoping a copy after their death. It's still a copy. And so then you have the question of identity. Is a copy identical? And I think that the answer there is difficult to come through to as well. So I would say simply because of the probability of hitting yes at each of those junctures, I don't think it's very likely that we will have the ability to move personal identity from the biological to the digital. The degree to which we can make copies of brain waves and information that can be digitized, we might be able to do that. I just don't think what we'll have is really the brain in a computer. We'll have a copy of some elements of some brains in a computer.
What about the soul, Dr. Shatzer? The Christian worldview believes in a soul that's a non-material part of our being that probably has a lot to do with our understanding and consciousness. Does transhumanism have any place in it for the soul?
This is another place where I have to be to try to be fair to the big variety within transhumanism. I want to be careful. For those that are coming from a secularist, materialist perspective, no, I mean they would just reduce the idea of the soul to something that we could explain with brainwaves and chemicals and all that. And so they would say, yeah, whatever that thing is, if you want to call it a soul, fine, we can get it in the computer too, because everything physical can be reduced to zeros and ones. For Christians who want to embrace transhumanism in some way, I think that they would want to hold on to this idea of the soul as something that obviously manifests itself physically, is connected in some mysterious way to our bodies and brains, but can't be reduced to our bodies and brains. And so that's why I think many transhumanists that are Christians focus not on digital immortality, but on ways that computers, pharmaceuticals, all those sorts of things can extend and enrich life for a longer amount of time. And then those that do begin to think about immortality try to maintain some sense of the soul and things like that in doing so.
Dr. Shatzer, you're really opening up our eyes to the variety of worldviews called transhumanism. Are you a transhumanist?
No, I'm not. And I think that that's for a few reasons. First of all, I'm primarily familiar with secular versions of transhumanism. One of my good friends from my time at Marquette as a doctoral student would identify as a transhumanist, and he and I have had conversations about it, and I respect him highly and his faith. And so I wouldn't want to say it's impossible for someone who trusts Christ to be a transhumanist. But to me, the baggage that comes along with that term just requires too much fixing as a Christian, because it is so rooted in a perspective of naturalism or physicalism or materialism, and because it is so optimistic about what humans can do on their own, and because it does seem to primarily cast future hope in the sense of just this current life extended forever and maybe gotten a little better. And I just don't think those are Christian pictures. And so for me, I see why some Christians want to say, hey, we can be transhumanists, and then let's just correct those other things. Let's just talk about how those things are wrong. For me, I don't think that it's worth identifying with that for what you have to deal with.
Dr. Shatzer, if we can pivot to talk about virtual reality, it's only a technology that you speak of on the side, peripherally in this text, but I believe that you do have an interest in it. Do you think there is a virtual reality church age that's emerging? Is there an appropriate way that VR should be a part of our church gatherings? What's your view?
This is a question that I probably would have answered a lot quicker 6 months ago. And I want to be fair and careful as I answer it now. First of all, I do not think that it is, well, let me reframe that. To be the church, even the language of church in the New Testament draws on this idea of gathering together, which has always included physical gathering, and not just because people didn't have the means to gather in other ways. I mean, I'm not saying, oh yeah, see, Paul didn't join virtual reality, so you shouldn't. Well, obviously he didn't. He didn't have it. And we see Paul using every technological means he can to convey the gospel, right? Paul writes letters, which we don't think of as technological means, but he was employing letters to teach and exercise authority when he wasn't able to be present. But even in those letters, we see Paul saying that he longs to be with the people. And as he talks about the churches, he talks about gathering. And so I think that when we think about virtual reality, we need to recognize, okay, that is not physical gathering. So it cannot substitute and should not substitute for physical gathering, except in times where it's impossible to gather physically. But that doesn't mean we have to reject virtual reality and say it's bad, stay away from it. We can use it like Paul to speak the truth of the gospel, to spread the gospel and things like that. And so I would want to say when it comes to virtual reality in the church, that we should absolutely see it as a technology that we can use to advance the gospel, but we should not see it as a substitute for physically gathering in local communities of faith as we can.
Dr. Shatzer, I think I'm in agreement with you, but if you would indulge me in working out some ideas here. I happen to be working in the final stages of a book project on virtual reality church. So I am grateful for your expertise here. So I think the position that is emerging for many is when we imagine the church, when we ask the question, can the church convene by virtual reality? And the presumption of that question is we mean, can the church solely and exclusively convene by virtual reality? Almost everyone is going to say no, unless there's absolutely no other possibility. But it seems to me that that's probably not the most useful question for our churches moving forward. Yes, we still want a physical presence. We still want to know each other personally. But telecommunication is going to get better in the decades ahead. And churches ought to be thinking not only about, can virtual reality replace every single use of our church building, but what uses of our church building can it augment and can it expand? What are your thoughts in that way? Are there ways that you would like to see the church starting to use VR in any capacity?
I think I like that. I like the direction that that's headed. And my question would be, why? And I think that the why question is important. To a similar way that the why question is important when it comes to these same technologies for education. Now, I'm all for educational access. I'm all for people who aren't able to move somewhere to still be able to get a good degree. But there's also always been something about self-sacrifice that that has played a role in education, right? And so hey, we should do this online because it's easier, to me actually mitigates against some of what people need to actually develop in an education, right? So I'm not against online education as a whole, but I do think that when I teach online, I have to think to myself and make sure that I remind my students, this doesn't mean everything's going to be easy, right? And we don't do it just because it's convenient. And so I think it would be the same thing with the church. The question shouldn't be, was it just more convenient for everybody if we don't actually have to drive to the church building? I don't know that convenience to me would be a strong enough reason to have a small group meet only virtually and then, go to the church on Sundays, maybe still for corporate worship. I think when we make convenience the main reason why, we're actually sacrificing something of the cost of discipleship. And so I guess that would be my thing. I like how you talked about augmenting and making it better. And I think that that's key to think about how can these technologies help us be more present to each other, physically present, but also present in these other ways throughout the week, not because of convenience, but it's actually less convenient to be engaging each other even more and being drawn together even more in community. And so that would be my one caveat, is that I think many churches, especially in North America, that are very pragmatic and numbers driven, we're just used to saying, well, what's convenient, what's easiest? And I just don't think that's always the best value to have.
It's brilliantly stated that convenience is not really the value we're seeking when we're trying to facilitate discipleship. Thank you very much for that reflection. Dr. Shatzer, I have to ask you, what's your view about virtual reality sacraments?
Yeah, well, see, now I'm a little more nervous that I know that you're working on this book on this topic. So I will say I haven't engaged the arguments on either side of this. My initial reaction in my ecclesiology, this probably comes out of being a Baptist theologian, but I think that there's something about being present together physically that is important for I'm assuming you're talking about communion, the Lord's Supper, as far as the sacraments go. I think that there's something physical that Jesus does when he says, "This is my body, this is my blood." So I think that there's something about the sacrament that is supposed to be physical, and I think there's something about practicing it that prioritizes being physically together. And so I'm not saying, like, the homebound, taking sacraments to the homebound has been something Christians have done for a long time because those people are unable to join the body. But it's not the same thing, and it's even done in a way that's meant to connect them to the physical body. And so I would probably want to know more detail about how someone was envisioning it in a virtual environment. But I think that even when we look at in 1 Corinthians 11, as Paul talks about how to go about the Lord's Supper, the priority that Paul seems to have that drives him in all of that is that this is a picture of the unity of the body. And there's something about physically gathering and eating together that plays an absolutely vital role in communicating what's being communicated there. So I would say no to sacraments in virtual reality. I also tend to say no to sacraments in subsets of the church. I get a little uncomfortable when youth groups are doing communion on their own, right? Because it's like, look, this isn't for your youth group. This is for the whole church. You're missing something here when you do it just with youth group. I know that there are those who would disagree with me on that and probably would on virtual reality as well.
Dr. Shatzer, I'm really excited to see your book come out, and it seems to me that technology is the philosophy of the day. Our tech gurus and our tech experts are kind of like the philosophers of our current Areopagus. So I'm delighted to see you engaging with them. May I ask if you have plans for future studies in this intersection of faith and technology?
Yeah, kind of. Currently, I'm working on some shorter pieces, particularly looking at theological anthropology, which comes out in this book a lot, and is just a fundamental issue when we're talking about technology. If we're going to use our tools well, we need to know what does it mean to be human well. So I'm doing some work in some edited volumes on that. I'm kind of kicking around some different ideas on continuing in this trend of looking at technology. In particular, getting a better understanding of how the Bible treats technology is intriguing to me. A lot of times if we want to look at the Bible and technology, we might pull out a couple passages that seem to talk about tools or something like that. And then we say, well, the Bible doesn't have much to say about technology today. But I think actually rooting ourselves in the image of God, but also in the task that God has given humans to be his image, and also the task that God has given to the church to point to the coming kingdom of God, I think provide much more interesting ways of thinking about faithful technology use that aren't as easy as, should I use this technology or not? But maybe more along the lines of, how can we use this technology to augment what we know is good, without letting the technology itself get in the driver's seat and become the good.
It's really well stated. Thank you very much. Dr. Shatzer, if I can close this interview with a question that we've been asking all of the interviewees on this program, and that is this: what would it mean for the church today to be united? How would we even recognize this unity? And what is it that we can do as Christians to pursue the unity for which Jesus prayed in John 17?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think at some level, and in particular when we think of questions of technology, I think one way that we can see the church's unity through what technology provides us is just the ability that we have to better understand Christians around the world right now, and to see especially the common theological heritage of the Bible, that God by his grace through his Spirit has maintained fruitfully around the world in places and ways that can surprise us. And so I think that just seeing that and being thankful for that is one way that we can achieve or work towards that unity. I mean, I don't think that unity necessarily means we have to figure out a way on our own to achieve ourselves into a common denomination or something like that. But I do think that using the opportunity to affirm the truth of the gospel where we see it, even when there might be disagreements in other places, is one way that we can do that, to first emphasize our common gospel heritage and not ignore differences, but see those differences through that common heritage rather than as an obstacle to it.
It's been our huge pleasure today to be speaking with Dr. Jacob Shatzer, Assistant Professor and Associate Dean in the School of Theology and Mission at Union University, and author of the text that we've been discussing today, Transhumanism and the Image of God, Today's Technology and the Future of Christian Discipleship. Thank you so much, Dr. Shatzer, for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.